Rotovisor is a new ride line that came out of DZBTO2 Illusionless Strife, and I've been having a blast playtesting and tinkering with this deck. It's been such a fun deck building challenge that I wanted to share the list that I've got so far. With this being a new ride line, let's start by discussing what Glanzel Rotovisor actually does. So, continuous, it's got 2 effects, continuous on Vanguard Circle. During your turn, if your order zone has 3 or more arenas, all your front row get power plus 5,000. Front row power gain, that's pretty good. Just depends on how easy it is to get those 3 arenas out and how soon it is. Then second effect is auto Vanguard Circle. Once per turn, at the end of battle, this unit attacked, you counterblast 2, draw a card, choose the same number of your rear guards as the number of your arenas in your order zone, stand them, and if you chose 3 or more rear guards, all your chosen rear guards get power plus 5,000 till end of turn. Drawing a card, restanding, up to potentially 4 or more rear guards, or really 4 would be the max that you'd want to for value. That's still really powerful output. And this is also super flexible as well, because if you only say have 2 arenas in your order zone, you can choose to just stand the front row rear guards and attack with both them for 5 attacks as soon as grade 3. Or you can choose to just restand a column as well. Like, there's a ton of built-in flexibility with this card, even more power gain. That's great for a multi-attack deck as well. Usually you want your multi-attacks to scale to hit over defensive triggers. Counterblast 2 is a bit pricey though, so it'll be interesting to see how this deck kind of compensates for it, because that usually leads to the deck being easily counterblast denied and burning out pretty quickly without the proper resource management. So, since the arenas are so important in this deck, let's actually go over one of them. So here we've got the Nova Grapple Arena Urban City, the only arena from this set. So it's a grade 2 set order that has simply 1 effect, auto in order zone when your unit attacks if you have a Vanguard with Rotovisor in its card name and another arena in your order zone was not rest this battle, rest this card, choose that unit that attacked, and it gets the red text effect, auto Vanguard Rearguard Circle when this unit attacks, hits, counter charge 1 or energy charge 2. You get this effect till end of that battle. So right away, this is our resource management card. It does require an on-hit, which originally I was like, ooh, that doesn't seem very good. But that pressure is actually a lot, because it pretty much puts your opponent in a position of where if you swing first and rest those, they either have to start dumping shield value right away to deny you those resources, which can put a lot of pressure on their hand and not leave them with any counter blast themselves, or they just force you to give it and then could potentially eat multiple attacks from the Rotovisor. So this card actually pairs with it a lot nicer than I thought it would be, and it actually makes that Counterblast 2 a lot easier to use, with the caveat that, of course, this is just one person's testing, and since this isn't a meta deck, there hasn't been much testing on the appropriate counterplay. So there's very much a possibility where that just guarding those early swings, denying those resources is good enough to just kind of stall out this deck. But at the same time, since you eventually have to give this deck damage anyway, eventually we'll kind of get there. So that's probably the most undertested part of the deck, but nonetheless, the core is still there to make it playable, which is nice. Other notes on this card though is because it's a grade 2 set order, that means you won't get to and there's no current ways to cheat these into play that aren't until you could get the 3 naturally anyway. That means that this deck won't hit the 3 set orders until turn 4. So this deck's game plan is mainly focused around getting to that turn 4 persona riding, setting up, getting your 3rd set order in play. That way your front row's at plus 15k and you get to restand 3 rear guards doing 5 attacks, with a column restand being one of them, and just pressure your opponent that way. With that being the main game plan, the goal of this deck in the early game is just to push damage and get the opponent as high damage as possible, while making sure that you have your persona ride, your arenas to set, as well as a board built to be able to benefit from that restand. And a lot of the choices in the main deck are centered around this game plan in particular. Getting into the deck list, the ride deck here is just Glanzel Rotovisor, Washer Rotovisor, Rotovisor, and just Rotovisor as the starter. So what you get out of Illusionless Strife here. Rotovisor can really be any star you want. I just chose it for thematic reasons, but the Rotovisor is the important part here, because when it's rode upon by a grade 2 with Rotovisor in its card name, you search your deck for 1 arena card, reveal it, put your hand, and shuffle your deck. So this guarantees you your arena card on turn 2, and that's super important. You really want to get that started and set up. Washer Rotovisor, Rotovisor does have a second effect, not relevant for this deck list. We don't run any in the main deck to benefit from it. Not a terrible effect, just there are better stuff that we could run. Wash Air Rotovisor, when it's wrote upon by grade 3 with Rotovisor in its card name, looks at the top 7 cards of your deck, chooses up to 1 grade 3 or greater Rotovisor in its card name, or up to 1 arena card from among them, reveal it, put your hand, and shuffle your deck. If you do not reveal a card, you may call this to Rearguard Circle. And because of that, its second effect is relevant. Auto Rearguard Circle, when this unit attacks, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Rotovisor in its card name, this unit gets power plus 5,000 until end of that battle. And with a restanding deck, just easy 5k, so it can hit bigger numbers, require more shield value. Fantastic. And it's specifically locked to a grade 3 greater Vanguard with Rotovisor. As I mentioned, Rotovisor can start multi-attacking right away, so this is a 15k when your opponent's on grade 2. That's pretty solid. But really, this card, that first effect here, the top 7 search, because the only valid targets right now are the Glanzel Rotovisor and the Arena card, and because we search 1 Arena off of Erd Rotovisor, that means there's max 6 targets in our deck when we do this ride-up. That's not a lot. So this card's probably the weakest part of the ride line, but it's necessary because of the Erd Rotovisor being such a crucial effect here. And it's still a nice consistency card. I've also found, because this deck does I shouldn't say quite a bit of soul, it can use a lot of soul if you find your pieces and sequence them in, or find them in an order that uses up that soul. Sometimes it's just perfectly acceptable to leave the Wash Air Rotovisor just with its effect and just use the soul elsewhere. And the reason to do that would be you just have grade 2s that you want to call down, or just attackers you want to call down to the front row, and that do more than just power plus 50k, which this deck does have, and that's completely valid as well. But that was the ride line. Washer does make me want to try out new stuff, but the Erd is just super crucial where I think it is worth it, and top 7 search is still at least decent to help find the pieces. It feels bad when you whiff it though. Moving into the main deck, let's start off with the main win condition of the deck and the cards we need to facilitate that, or at least the main cards we need to facilitate that. Of course, 3 copies of the Glanzel Rotovisor for Persona Ride, our 4 arena cards, and because this deck really does want to burst down starting as soon as that turn 4, because it does not have the best longevity, I do run the run Gradius Gradale, giving us a 4th copy of Persona Ride. This may seem a bit at odds with what the deck is trying to do, because you would either play this or set a arena, but we do run a card here that lets us play an extra order a turn, meaning that we can go Gradius Gradale and then play that card to then play the Urban City. So it's perfectly fine. I'll get to that card in a little bit. But then focusing over on the Urban City, we want to max this card out, because if we're only running 3, the moment one of these gets damage checked, our game plan it doesn't fully crumble, but all of a sudden you're not getting that 5k from the first gear. You're not getting the 5k for the units restood. We want to see 3 order cards, get them into order zone, so thus we want to run the 4 in the event that one of them does get damage checked. But also, it's nice to be able to set up all 4 and just get a full column restand on both your side columns and pressure. That's a lot. This deck isn't built to consistently do that, but does have the option to do that as well if it's feasible. So since these are the main goal of the deck, of course, just max these out, make sure you can get these as consistently as possible. And this deck, while it would prefer to just kill the opponent on turn 4 when we do this play, sometimes it does have to go to turn 5, but also maximizing our chances to make sure we can find the Persona Ride to repeat on turn 5, just to seal the deal, is also important. Next up, we have the main attacker of the deck, the Compassionate Mechanic here. Compassionate Mechanic is another new support card out of Illusionist Strife, and it has 2 effects. Continues Rearguard Circle during your turn if your zone has 2 or more arenas. This unit gets power plus 5,000. Just extra power gain. Great. That's why Wash Air Rotovisor was quite nice on Rearguard Circle, and this just gets it continuously. Then auto Rearguard Circle once per turn. At the end of battle, this unit attacks if your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater and an arena in your order zone was rested this battle. Energy Blast 3, draw a card, choose one of your other units, and it gets power plus 5,000 till end of turn. So this deck doesn't use energy otherwise, and can even generate energy through the set orders. So just having a great use for it, draw a card in 5k, phenomenal. Like, this is the card you want to see on your turn 3, because this card is also not locked behind your opponent's Vanguard's grade, so you can start doing it right away. It's just pressure, it's card draw, it's even more pressure. You get 2 of these on board. If you're getting off Glanzel Rotovisor skill, I kind of glossed over it, the draw card, that's very nice to kind of just get some extra card draw to build up your hand. Like, if you get off the Compassion Mechanic's really easy to get off, so you get a draw right away. If you can get off Rotovisor effect, that's the second card, a draw. If you can find another Compassion Mechanic, you're drawing like 6 in a turn, and that really does help this deck have a better chance of surviving to get to its Persona Ride, and even in turns after that. So definitely want to max out this card, because this is like the one of the ideal attackers of the deck. So that was all the Rotovisor specific support. Like they specifically function with Rotovisor and the Arenas. So next we move into cards I still think are part of the core of the deck, at least for until more support is revealed, as these cards are crucial to make sure we can find our pieces, get to that win condition, push our opponent for damage as well. And the common theme you'll see amongst all these support cards is that they have multiple uses. And that's the big thing for a deck like this that has so little support and is really and the support is kind of focused more on the late game stuff, is we need our other support cards to kind of serve almost double duty to make sure that the deck is as functional as it can be. So starting off, we run 4 copies of the Sickle Blade of Inquest Habitable Zone. So the 2 functions of this card is, in the early game, you're discarding it and drawing, something that the core support doesn't do, but is super necessary because we're wanting to find Persona Ride, we're wanting to find Arenas, we're wanting to find that compassionate mechanic to use, but we also still need to have shield value to just not get blown out of the board, or blown out of the game. And this card really does help that, and is probably our primary use of soul in the early, or it is our primary use of soul in the early game. The second function of this card is that second effect, which is our consistent way to find our third set order. As long as you Persona Ride, you can call this card and we can find it no problem. This is also the reason we can run Gradius Gradile, because this card specifically lets us play a second order per turn. So we can go Gradius Gradile, trigger Persona Ride, call down Habitable Zone, and use its effect. It's live now, and search out that order, still play it, and we're good to go. So this card is I think the most important consistency tool of the deck. It just perfectly bridges what this deck needs to do in the early game and in the late game as well. Though admittedly, after we get to that use to find the third set order, you can use it to find the fourth set order. Doesn't always need to happen. From there, it kind of just falls off, but at that point, you're just trying to win the game anyway. So definitely want to maximize out on this card because we really want to see that throughout the early into that fourth Persona Ride turn. Next up, this is an Illusionless Strife card, but it's a generic card. We've got the Great Sickle of White Flash Baldereed. So this card, because it's a new card, I'll go over this, has 2 effects. Continuous rearguard circle. During the battle, this unit boosted if your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, and your order zone has 2 or more set orders. This unit gets power plus 5,000. So right away, 13k booster. More pressure, power to get more cards out of your opponent's hands. Great card on board. Then at the end, auto rearguard circle, at the end of battle, this unit boosted. If your order zone has a set order, put this unit to soul, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 grade 2 or greater unit card from, or set order from among them, reveal it, put your hand, and shuffle your deck. So this card, not only is it great for just early game, like late game pressure for the power, but it also throughout the entire course of the game can convert into soul, and it's a consistency tool. It can help us find our set orders. It can help us find our Persona Rides. If we don't need either of those or don't find any of those in the top 5, we can instead use it to find other key pieces such as the Compassionate mechanic, maybe our Habitable Zone for our Persona Ride turn, or some of the other cards we'll touch on after this. It's just the double duty of great board piece as well as a consistency tool makes this an auto 4 include to really help. And where this card is really important is this deck can consistently find the set order for turn 2, so the first set order set, and the third set order set for turn 4. It doesn't have a consistent way to find the set order for turn 3. Thus, as we'll get in the Mulligan, a lot of times we want to try to find it in the Mulligan, but also we've got Baldereed to help dig for it, and the Washer Rotovisor Ride line effect to be able to help dig for it as well. The next card is Combine Rusher from Blazing Dragon Reborn, DBT 06. And this card's 2 purposes are that it is a phenomenal discard for Ride deck because of that second still to recall itself. And that is a huge part of this deck I kind of mentioned a bit earlier, is we really don't want to be discarding shield value or key pieces because we need to survive till turn 4. We need those key pieces to facilitate our game plan. Combine Rusher is a perfect one because then it also builds board from drop, because this deck also wants to build board, or else you need cards to restand anyway. And on top of that, once it's on board and we're attacking grade 3 or greater units, it's a 20k attacker on its own, so it scales phenomenally, just a ton of pressure as well, especially when restood. So this just felt like the perfect inclusion to kind of cover that facet of the deck, needing just more good discard targets for Ride deck other than Habitable Zone, but also a way to build board as well. And of course, one thing that also made it so that I actually did not think of this card right away, shout out to Deck Flare, his deck profile, for showcasing this, because I did not have this card on my radar, simply because of the counterblast. I'm like, we need the counterblast for the Vanguard restand. and I was just kind of underestimating the order's ability to countercharge cards. So a lot of times in the early game, just being able to use the counterblast to call this out is perfectly fine. Eventually get the counterblast to restand and just pressure the opponent's Vanguard anyway. Similar situation why Habitable Zone, the counterblast is perfectly fine. I've opted to use that one as well. But yes, 4 copies of this card, we really want to see this card early, and even in the late game, just calling this down from hand for a 20k attacker plus whatever power it gets is also a great way to close out the game. A final card that I think is part of what I consider the core of the deck, that is probably the most debatable though, is Fort Elbard X Striker. The 2 functions of this card that I really like is it can operate as a great attacker or booster on board, the booster being the key part there. And it's also not dead in hand, as long as your opponent's checked a trigger, it's a 10k shield in hand, which might seem not all that great since it requires our opponent to check a defensive trigger. But this deck, while it does have draw cards, it seems like it pluses more than it actually does in practice. So just a card that lets this deck scale a bit better against defensive triggers is still super valuable as well. This card also has additional kind of benefits that aren't the main reasons why I'm running it, but are still nice nonetheless. For starters, offensively, since it gains 10k power, if their opponent checked a defensive trigger, it just says for whatever attack this attacks or boosts, that defensive trigger is nullified, essentially. And that's really great for a deck like this. Our opponent, that defensive trigger doesn't mean our opponent guard less, they still need to guard it with just as much as before they check the trigger as well. On top of that, they remove the over trigger effect to get the front row 5k. That's great in a restanding deck. It's obviously not going to consistently be live, but it's a nice little bonus if you've found over trigger and guard with it. Just a little extra offensive output. I just felt like this card really rounded off this deck very nicely because it's a card in hand and on board applications. And it also meant that drawing into it off of a drive check, it isn't a dead card. That was one of the issues I was also having. I really didn't want more dead cards in hand, and I really wanted cards that had like a lot of output in hand as well. Sure, it's a dead card if our opponent doesn't check a defensive trigger, which can sometimes be relevant, but also usually at that point, you know, we really just want to call these down to boost with anyway. That's more so for early game application where it's really nice. And in the event, in early game, if we check a defensive trigger, there's just a 10k shield regardless, which is really nice. So again, I think it's debatable. I'll kind of discuss this more when I go over the other options for the flex slots, but so far I do think this is just the best option the deck has. It really serves its role well for both defense and offense, and as of right now, I don't want to change it off of 4 copies. Next up are the 2 flex slots of the deck. I run Bulba Mine and Freezing Wave in these slots. So the reason I run Bulba Mine is because this is a great way to play around our opponent counterblast denying us, and it also gives us complete agency unlike the set order since our opponent has to let it hit to be able to accumulate the resources. It's also a bit of extra stroll, which can sometimes be relevant, not super relevant, but I just like it. I was running this at more copies, like originally I was running at 4 copies, but I just found that I really want my deck to do more. Like Bulba Mine is very one note, and as I mentioned, I want the most out of my cards, so it felt more appropriate for a flex slot here. And again, I wasn't having too much trouble getting off those multi-attack. Like even if my opponent counterblast denied me in the games I played, it felt like I was like, okay, cool, you just used a ton of shield fire hand, I'll just hit you really hard next turn. So yeah, I like the one Bulba Mine so far. I do think in certain matchups, if you know your meta well enough, you can adjust this, increase it to maybe 2 copies as well, especially if they're on like counterblast 9, you really just want to push through. I do think that's relevant, but I also wanted to test out the Freezing Wave here, which is why I'm doing the 1-1 split, because this is a great defensive card. New one from Illusionless Strife. You play this with Soul Blast 1, you get to choose one of your units that is being attacked, and it gets power plus 10,000 until end of that battle for each rest set order in your order zone. So this can be a big shield. The later in the game it goes, the more set orders that you have set up, and you're always resting them anyway for its effect. This deck, as I kind of mentioned earlier with the X Striker, it seems like it pluses more than it actually does. So especially against multi-attack deck where the number of cards in hand is super important, just having a 1-card massive guard for some of those is very helpful. That being said, I did want to run the 1-1 split and not double up on specifically Freezing Wave either, because hands can get a bit clunky if you find multiple of your blitz orders, and sometimes with the X Striker you won't even have the soul to be able to use it. You either want to save it for an X Striker or you just don't have it because you use it with X Striker. So thus I felt 1 copy felt appropriate. Again, this deck isn't trying to necessarily survive longer than it needs to. It's really just trying to set up so it can win on that turn 4. Survive till turn 4, set up to win. And thus I kind of relegated this to the idea of if I find it, this is a great defensive tool, can come in real clutch, but I don't necessarily want to need to find it. Same thing with Bulba Mine here. So that's what I chose for these flex slots right now when I'm testing it out. Moving over to the staples of really any deck, for the PGs, got 3 of the effect PGs and the 1 Elementary Sanctitude. There is nothing about this deck that justifies deviating from this norm. This is just usually optimal for most decks anyway. For the triggers, I run 8 crit, 3 draw, 4 heal with a 2-2 split between the 25k shields if my opponent's unit has attacked 2 or more times this turn. Yeah, 2 or more times. And the Eldo Breath for the over trigger. So I opted for 8 crits because it just syncs a bit better with this deck's game plan to push damage early on. Early game crits, higher damage, more pressure on my opponent once I get to the multi-attack. This deck doesn't need fronts. It's got plenty of power output in the front row. That has not been something I felt like has been lacking in this deck. But draw, again, as I mentioned before, felt like it was lacking a little bit. The deck feels like it draws more. It looks like it draws more than it actually does. Thus, I want the draw triggers to just give me a little extra insulation there. And really, the reason I opted for 3 draws and 8 crits is because, again, I just want this deck to set up to win, not necessarily survive longer than it needs to. So those draws are there to insulate, but I really want to focus on that offense. Now, the reason for the 5k crits, despite me discussing some potential lack of soul issues, that's only really if you find multiple habitable zones and then are surviving multiple turns to want to use multiple X strikers. But at that point, a lot of times I felt by the time that I'd want extra soul for X strikers, I'm either losing anyway or I'm winning anyway, so I'd rather just maximize on my numbers to round out and just put on the most offensive pressure. As for the heal split here, same reason for the freezing wave. Multi-attack decks, this deck doesn't plus as much as it appears to, so I just want to maximize my shield value against decks that can throw out as many attacks. I need a bunch of cards to guard. Big number, 3 attack decks are a bit easier, but big number multi-attack decks, not as much, and this just makes it a bit easier to just throw down guard against those multi-attack decks and conserve cards in hand, or just give me more shield potential with less cards in hand. Elder Breath as well, this is just good old Grant Gate OT, can just auto-win games. In this deck, it can be a bit awkward if the opponent counterblast denies you on your Vanguard, and by the time you get to your Vanguard swing, you're not restanding, maybe they PG it and you check Elder Breath. That can definitely shut it down, but at the same time, this is such a high variance card to begin with, and the chances of running into that scenario versus you do get your restand and can just auto-win, I think outweigh it. And pretty much all OTs in that exact scenario don't do too much. You've got some that are better, like the 2 new OTs from Festival Booster, which are a bit better. But again, those are more just helping you survive, and I really want to push this deck more towards just trying to win. This is also a lot better in the early game to push damage. That's why I opted to run it. As for the mulligan of this deck, typically speaking, I just shuffle back in triggers. Our pieces are good enough where typically I like to keep them, and I don't really want to maximize my chances of drawing into more triggers. I'd rather have them in deck. And with the multi-function of these cards, it's usually good enough to keep as well. I will say though, sometimes I do mulligan back Persona Ride, especially if I just want to dig for better pieces. If I'm going second specifically, because I've got plenty of opportunities to try to dig into another copy of it. So it is a bit hand dependent as well, making those judgment calls. But in general, Baldereed, Habitable Zone, Combine Rusher, they're auto keeps. They function phenomenally in the early game, and a lot of times these are our 2 main cards, so we do want to keep them. Even Compassionate Mechanic for a turn 3 push for draw is also a pretty good keep as well. The main goal is really just getting those Persona Rides back in deck, and there's also nothing in this deck that I want to necessarily aggressively mulligan for. I would rather just kind of keep playable cards to push up because they are all usually good enough in general. But again, there might be some weird hands where some of these rules I'm outlining just don't apply. So do just kind of experiment on your own with that. This is just kind of a general guideline for what I like to do. And PG, as per usual with this deck, if you're up against a deck, you'll want the PG. Keep 1. I don't usually keep more than 1, but otherwise, if it's up against a deck where you don't, like a multi-attack deck where you just want to maximize on shield value to try to 1-card guard stuff, I mulligan back PGs all the time. So with the main deck out of the way, let's go over other flex cards that I have considered running for this deck, or even tested out myself that you might want to test out as well. Starting off, Bracing Angel Ladder. This can easily be slotted in for Gradius Guardalay, still functions the same way with the only difference of you need to find a Glanzau Rotovisor for Persona Ride for it to work. This would be specifically great for the Shiranui matchup to preserve your board, insulate yourself from some attacks, but I don't think this deck is really being Shiranui to begin with, so I'd rather maximize on what this deck is trying to do to win other matchups. It really isn't built to bring to a competitive tournament and expect to win. I don't think Rotovisor has that potential yet. Thus, I don't see much reason to run an anti-meta card when I'm not really expecting to win against it anyway. I'd rather just maximize on what this deck does. But if you do want to try this out to try to beat the Shiranui matchup, or you're going to be facing at locals and don't want to leave high and dry, you can easily slot this in as well. Next up, I think this is the most promising card for the text of the flex slots, and that is the Pansmeria. Mainly for that first effect, just extra soul or energy usage, draw cards. Sometimes you can even have extra counterblast if your opponent is really letting those attacks hit for you to, with the arena effect in play there for the on hit. And it's just live throughout the game. Extra card draw is really good. Its second effect isn't terrible. It can technically search you out your final arena card. It's just not as good because you have to discard a card compared to the habitable zone. Thus why I do generally prefer habitable zone over the Pansmeria. We also have other ways to use energy anyway, but as a flex slot, I think this would be a perfectly acceptable card at 1 or 2 copies. Next card, I did test this one, the Refablishment Dock. It pairs really great with Habitable Zone. You can now go Habitable Zone to search either this out or your arena card, and as long as you got the other one in hand, pretty much you'll play this one for free. You get to draw a card replacing it, which is great, and then all your grade 2s get boost. And that in a deck that is pretty top heavy with grade 2s, this is good. It lets you round out your board quite nicely. That being said, I do like the Elbard X Striker better for that role, and it doesn't make me feel like I need to give my grade 2s boost because it's in the deck. And the reason I like it more than Refablishment Dock is because this is a Brickin' deck. It's exactly good if you have Habitable Zone and either have this in hand or the arena card to search out. Otherwise, it's dead card, and I don't want that in this deck because this deck really needs as high quality cards to help round it out as possible for it to function, I think, at its peak capabilities. Next up is another card I tested originally in those flex slots, and that is the Lloyd Akazerith. I cannot pronounce that. But this card, specifically for its second effect to help build a board, is really nice. It just allowed me to be a bit more aggressive, find a bit more of my pieces more consistently, thin the deck out. But ultimately, I felt like it was a bit redundant with what I was already doing anyway. Sure, it could come up quite nicely if I don't find my Combine Rushers, but I haven't missed it since I cut it. I feel like the deck has still functioned just a-okay even without it, and I prefer to focus on rounding out other weak points of the deck that Bulba Mine and Freezing Wave cover over this, but I still think it's a valid card to test out as well. Next up, I consider this guy for a bit, Assembly Dragon. This is new from Illusionless Strife. It's got a single effect auto. When this unit is placed on rearguard circle, Soul Blast to perform one of the following. Search your deck for up to 1 set order, reveal it, and if your Order Zone has a card of the same name as this card, put your hand and shuffle your deck. Or you can choose a set order in your Order Zone, and if your Order Zone has 3 or more cards with the same name as that card, you countercharge 1. So this is a flexible, just pinpoint order searcher that can work on your grade 3. Notably, this deck does not have that capability with my current list. And late in the game, it can just act as a countercharge. The reason I decided to ultimately cut this is I think Bulba Mine serves the deck a bit better because I run the Elbard X Striker, which can use up that excess soul, so Soul Blast 2 is a bit expensive. And the reason I also opted for that route, because of course I could cut that, run these to give me that guaranteed searches. I don't think that guaranteed search is all that worth. Like, this deck I haven't found really has trouble finding that second set order. And on top of that, actually funny enough, if you find Habitable Zone and order on your turn 3 or your turn 4, you can still set up double order with that play to get caught up anyway. So ultimately, I just felt like this card, while it does seem like it synergizes very well with the deck at a service level, I just don't think it's all that powerful of a card. And I do think the cards I'm running this deck can cover exactly what, or close enough to what this card does, just better and more conducive to the deck. Like, those cards have dual functionality, making it a bit better. So you can experiment with this card, maybe as like a one of. It does take away from your X Strikers, maybe cut back on that if you really want to try it out, but I do think that the X Strikers serve a better role than this one, and the deck has what this card does covered anyway. Another consistency searcher is the Pantera the Slasher, excuse me. This is another Illusionist Strife card. Auto when this unit is placed on rearguard circle from hand. If you did not play any orders this turn, you discard a card from hand, search your deck for up to 1 order card without regale its piece, discard it, and it gets the red text ability continues. This card can be played from your drop, and when it would be put on into the drop from being played, put on the bottom of the deck instead. It gets this effect until end of turn, and shuffle your deck. Another way to pinpoint search the order card, starting as soon as turn 2 actually. The reason I don't like it other the other options is, well, we got a turn 2 search anyway, and it forces you to discard a card. And it's not like the arena card nets you any card advantage anyway, thus I find the cards I am running a bit better than this card. It's also very linear as well, but it could technically be a flex card for a dire street of just need to play it down. And you also, the reason to run it possibly over Assemblied in that slot is that it doesn't use up soul. Next up, I got a pair of cards here. It is the Dual Nations from the latest Festival booster, and the two options are Gallant Mechanical, Agility, Valtrosa and Liel, or Dark Bond, Abyss, Surga, and Dargage. Got a bit blurry there on the camera. But these two cards are very great consistency cards for this deck. Valtrosa and Liel, when it's placed on rearguard circle from hand other than during the battle phase, lets you choose a normal unit without Sentinel or up to one order card from your drop and put it on the bottom of your deck. Then you counterblast one, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to one card from among them, reveal it, and perform one of the following. If the revealed card is an order card without Regale Speeds, you put it into your hand and shuffle your deck. If the revealed card is grade less than or equal to your Vanguard's grade, you may call it to rearguard circle and shuffle your deck. This card, that first effect is not usually that useful. Theoretically, it means that you could discard an arena early on and then loop it back to deck and search it out later. But really the main idea behind this card is that it functions in one of two ways. Either if you find the order you need it, you add it to hand from the top 5, or you just build a board. That being said, while I think it's valid for a flex slot, I think again the deck just kind of covers what this card does already, just better because those cards are more flexible throughout the game. While this one's very one note, call it down and do the thing. So it just felt a bit redundant to me and probably doing it the least useful, or at least doesn't have the flexibility that the other cards have. Surga and Dargage is in a similar situation, but what it does is, when this unit is placed on rearguard circle from hand other than during the battle phase, look at the same number of cards from the top of your deck as the number of set orders in your order zone, plus 1. Choose a card from among them, put it to your soul, and if you looked at 2 or more cards, shuffle the deck. Counterblast 1, perform one of the following. Choose a grade 2 or greater unit card from your soul, put it to your hand. Choose a set order from your soul and put it into your hand. So this card, similarly, has a bit less search in the early game, but can scale very well into the late game with that top search effect because you're just building up set orders. So a bit more variability, but a bit more scalability. It's also, compared to the Valtrosa and Liel, that is. And then its ability to loop back stuff is a bit more versatile because you can loop back Persona Rides and you can loop back your grade 2 or graders. So you lose out on the ability to call grade 1s like Valtrosa and Liel does, but you do gain the ability to pinpoint search now Persona Rides on top of it while also still getting your order back. The order is also a bit less likely because now you need to find it in the tops, usually less than top 5 with its effect. But regardless, it's just kind of some give and some take. They kind of serve different utilities here. Like this one's a bit better into the later game. This one's a bit better in the early game as well. That being said, both of them they aren't as flexible and are a bit redundant with what the deck is already doing. Thus, I value the other cards, but they could fit into these flex slots as well just for some extra consistency. Next up, we've got some cards that I did test out that I ultimately cut. First one is the Abbott Robust. So this was to be able to pinpoint search the order starting on turn 3. It is some nice consistency. It also is a 23k attacker, which is great. But again, it's very one note in what it does, and it really felt bad to just try and draw into and not have any shield value. The deck can cover what this card does, just I think a bit more flexibly, which just kind of push out this card, despite it being a solid card. I just don't think it is good enough for this deck. Same story for the Soul Dyed Sturmer here. Just being able to help search out with the top 5 whenever you play an order card, some extra consistency. It's a good attacker. So it does, I think, fit this flex slot a bit better in its role, but for main deck viability, like part of the core of it, it definitely, I don't think, keeps up. It's very much would fall into that slot. But again, it's a bit redundant, and I don't think the consistency for finding orders is something that I need extra help with from these flex slots. That's why it's not played, but it is a valid option nonetheless. Finally, this is a card I have not tested, but I found when sifting through bulk that I think could be interesting for this deck, and it is Lady Fencer of Bipolar Nebula. The reason I think this is interesting is it's a body on board, so you apply offensive pressure, that then tags itself out for a blitz order for some defensive application. Just giving this deck that gets some offensive push, whether it be in the early, mid-game, whatever, then tag in the defense option to help this deck survive until turn 4, or if it needs to even survive until turn 5. So that's something I think it might be worthwhile testing. I haven't really put too much thought into what I would cut specifically for this, or if this is even worth it. My one hesitation is, if I'm running this, either I'm running it as the other one of with the freezing wave, so it can act as a second freezing wave, but it's also a body on board. But if I wanted to dedicate more slots to this, I don't know quite what I would cut, because again, I would then want to run more freezing waves, which really cuts away at the core of the deck, which I think is super solid right now. But that's really up to you all. If you want to test it, let me know your findings down in the comments below. I'd be really curious to see if you think this is all worth it and how well it's functioning. And just to wrap up this deck, is this going to be the next meta threat? Absolutely not. There's a reason no one's playing this one. It is not very good. That being said, I'm surprised with how much first fun I've been having with it. This has been a blast to play, and it's functional. Like, at first glance, I'm like, is this going to be functional, or is this just going to be my opponent counter blast behind me and I can't do anything? And I haven't really found that to be the case. I think this is just the epitome of a really fun and interesting deck. It does some very interesting stuff, even if it's got some shortcomings that don't make it meta viable. I think support can definitely help this in the future. I know a lot of people joke, oh, wait till it gets a way to accelerate the auras in the aura zone, so on turn 3, you got the 3 set up. I don't know if I find that the most interesting for this deck. I'm going to be honest, because that's actually a very scary proposition where you want to damage deny this deck. Definitely would make it better. But also just kind of keeping it as a fun turn 4 deck, I think is quite interesting. I'd love to see kind of the support maybe lean a bit more into that with some extra card draw, maybe some more like Combine Rusher type effects. I think that could be really, really interesting. And finally, I just wanted to address, I kind of mentioned this throughout this video, that this deck seems like it pluses more than it actually does. And that is because all the search effects that specifically search out the order, because the order doesn't inherently plus, it means that you're not really going plus, and in some cases, like the Balderite, if you find it, you're going minus off of it once you play the order. It just accumulates energy or counter charge or counter blast to be able to use, not actual cards in hand. So really, these draw effects on Rotovisor and Compassion Mechanic are at first making up for it, which does put down the plussing a little bit. And it's really super important for such a piece-reliant deck that also is trying to survive until turn 4. So hopefully we'll see some more systems with this in the future. And now I want to hear from you all. What are you running in your Glanzau Rotovisor list that has been working out for you all that I didn't include in my deck list? Please explain why. I'd be very interested to see, as since this deck is really so under workshop due to not being good. I love exchanging notes with you all just to try to make it as good as possible, even if it's just for fun. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.